It's this combination of attributes that convinced the INAX board that Tom would be a wonderful guest speaker in a community like Austin that is open to new ideas. And without further ado, I'm going to give you Thomas Campbell.
Thank you. I'm Tom Campbell. My subject today is consciousness and the larger reality, the inside story. Before I get started, I also would like to thank Garrick Siansky, Bob Price, and the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies for making all this possible. First, some introductory remarks to provide a little context for our interaction. I have to mention the books I've written and tell you a bit about them, since that's really the reason that we ended up together in this room tonight. I was invited here because I wrote the My Big T.O.E trilogy. 3 books, Unifying philosophy, physics, and metaphysics. Books about you, about consciousness, the larger reality. And you can find more about these books at my website, which is www.mybigto.com. The lectures that I give generally are a very brief overview of these books, and I will do that tonight. The workshop will go into a lot more detail. There will be quite a bit of material in the workshop that is not in the books. If you knew me well, you'd know that I'm an introvert. That's somebody who enjoys quiet and solitude, avoids social situations, and never talks to more than just a few people at a time. Before I wrote these books, I knew the same information I know now, but only a few people knew that I knew. Life was much simpler then. But it was not nearly so rewarding, so interesting, or so useful to others. So though public speaking is an unnatural act for me, I'm really glad to be here, to have this opportunity to share some of what I've learned over the last 35 years researching consciousness and the nature of reality. I'm going to give you a very brief thumbnail sketch of my background, what these books are about, and then a little preview of what's going to happen in the workshop tomorrow. There's 2 things that you're going to need to do, kind of an attitude you'll need to have in order to get as much as you can out of this lecture tonight and out of the workshop. You must be open-minded, and you must be skeptical. Open-minded because the big picture, as I'm going to paint it tonight, will require you to transcend old paradigms. It's a cliche, but this is kind of true and true again in this. More than one paradigm must you transcend. Transcend cultural beliefs, because that's the nature of breakthrough. Breakthrough requires you to transcend old ways of viewing things, old ways of thinking. You just apply the same concepts, you just come up with the same answer. So it takes something new. This is not going to be a look at the historical database from some different or clever analytical perspective. Okay, so open-minded is required, because otherwise, the first time I run over top one of your most cherished beliefs, you're going to turn off and go away and miss an opportunity to actually see the bigger picture. And there's a very good probability that I will run over several of your most cherished beliefs. Skeptical, because otherwise you run the risk of believing what I tell you. You also run the risk of not believing what I tell you. And if you do either, it's not particularly valuable to you. Whether you believe or disbelieve is not the point. I don't really want you to leave this lecture tonight believing what I say or disbelieving what I say. I want you to leave with an interest in finding out. And the consciousness is subjective. It's about you. It's your consciousness. And the only way to explore that consciousness is not by reading a book or hearing a lecture. It's by exploring your own consciousness. So it takes participation on your part to find out whether what I'm telling you is true. Please hold your questions until we get to the end. this material tends to generate questions by the thousands, and then the answers generate even more questions. We wouldn't get past the first 2 pages if we had questions as we went, so please hold them. I'm going to try to have about 15, 20 minutes worth of questions at the end. There'll be a lot more time for questions in the workshop. Okay, first question I think you must have is, who is this guy? Where did he come from? You know, I've never heard of him before. Well, first I'll tell you what I do in this reality frame. I'm a physicist, went to college, majored in physics and math, went on to graduate school in physics, picked up a master's degree, went on to another graduate school, worked on a PhD. I did my thesis work in experimental nuclear. Never worked in that field really. I left university and took a job immediately doing applied physics. You know, universities do research physics and they do theoretical physics. If you work out in what I call the real world, no offense to you academicians out there, but if you work in the real world, you basically just do applied physics. That's what I've been doing. My first job was in technical intelligence. That was a government job. I did physics, modeling, electrical engineering kinds of things, electronic systems, computer simulation, all those sorts of things. Then I went on to National Missile Defense as a contractor, technology development, sensor systems, radar systems, models, software engineering, program management, systems engineering, integration, vulnerability, risk analysis. Then on to NASA, where I do risk analysis. I produce physics models. What physics models are is very detailed, high-fidelity models that represent the real world, the physical world. And the point of those at NASA is to determine what the behavior of the systems will be under adverse conditions. In other words, what can go wrong, and if it goes wrong, what happens, and what can you do about it? So it's kind of a risk analysis function. So believe it or not, I wasn't always a 10 sigma kind of guy. You know, I at one time was almost normal, like at least some of you probably are. Actually, I was retired before I went to NASA, and they hunted me down and made me an offer I couldn't refuse, so I'm back in the workforce, unfortunately. Okay. So how did a nice physicist like me end up talking about metaphysics, consciousness? Doesn't sound like what physicists generally talk about. Well, I wrote these books because I was finally able to integrate the metaphysics and my understanding of consciousness with physics. Finally got to a point where there was a logical connection between these things. You have to do some explaining to let people get an idea of how it is you got to be strange enough to write books that are as strange as these. So what happened to me, my story is, I had just taken my first job. My boss came into me and tossed Journeys Out of the Body at me and said, "Tom, read this. I want to know what your take is on it." Well, I was a young physicist, fresh out of graduate school, and I thought maybe this was a test. You know, uh-oh. You know, was I going to lose my job here if I gave him the wrong answer? But I read the books, and I went back and I told him exactly what I thought about it. I said, well, you know, there's 3 ways to look at it. 1, this guy Monroe is just nuts. You know, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He thinks he does. He's having hallucinations or some other sort of mental illness, and he's writing these stories. 2, he's a very clever guy and would like to make some money selling books. You know, so he's writing these amazing stories so that they will interest people. He'll sell books. 3 is, this is real. He's a solid guy. He's done these experiments, like he said. He's gotten this data. He's collected the evidence. And reality is a whole lot bigger than I thought it was. Well, those were the 3 choices. But I didn't know which one of them was true. And neither did my boss or anybody else. Soon, maybe 3 months later, found out that Bob Monroe lived just about 30 miles away and set up an appointment to go see him. So we went out to Bob's, and I was very anxious to go because I wanted to know which one of those three was true. So I go to Bob's, and Bob lived on a very nice estate. He was a gentleman farmer. He was a CEO and owner of a cable company. Of course, this was back in 1970, when being owner of a cable company meant that you were very forward-looking. There weren't a lot of cable companies. They were just starting to pop out of the ground at that time. And as it turned out, Bob was not crazy. And he had, millions of dollars in his bank account, so he wasn't trying to hustle books. He didn't need the book sales. He was a very bright, serious guy, had a personality like an engineer, very methodical, very logical, loved acronyms. He was a very straightforward fellow. And toward the end of that evening, he took us up to this laboratory that he was just building. He had just finished the construction and didn't really have anything inside of it yet. It was just empty, shell. And he said, listen, you guys are all scientists and engineers, and we were. That was the kind of group I worked in. He said, would any of you want to help me put up my lab and get it going? We're going to study consciousness. Well, I was like a kid that just been offered grand prize. My hand went up and said, me, I'd be glad to do this. And another fellow about my age, a few years older, did the same thing. And I said to Bob, I said, I'd be glad to do this, whatever time it takes, however long it takes, but my price is I want you to teach me what you know about out of body. And the reason I made that deal with him is I knew that if I didn't experience it, there wasn't anything I could really do about it that would be serious. If I was just listening to Bob's stories about what he did, then it wouldn't have been real to me. No matter how much respect I had for Bob or how much I believed him, it's different between an intellectual understanding and a gut level knowing that it's true because you've been there and done that. There's a big difference between those two. And the second one is really not an easy place to get to. Excuse me, I have a little scratchy throat here, little allergy issues. Okay, so Bob took us up on it. He thought about it a little while. He didn't take us up on it right away. He was maybe looking for something better, but that was all he had. So he took us up on it, and we started going out to Whistlefield Farm, which is where he lived. And we would spend at least 3 days a week from about 6:30 in the evening, right after dinner, to about 2:30 at night or in the morning, next morning, working with Bob. Some of the time we'd be putting equipment together, doing designs, designing hardware and equipment in his lab, running wires. And the other half of the time we'd be in his isolation booths, and he would be training us on out-of-body experience. And he didn't really know how to do this either. He had never tried to train people before, so we were his guinea pigs. And he did a marvelous job. In about a year, I'd say, maybe 2 years. We did this for about 10 years. And we would come out at least one of the weekend days every week. So it was like 4 days a week, maybe 6, 8 hours at a bite. So we're putting in almost as much as a full-time job. It was like 30 hours a week or so that we did for about a decade. And in a couple of years, Bob had us trained to go out of body, experience these other reality frames whenever we wanted to, very quickly, very easily. He was a good teacher. And he had 2 points. One, he wanted to learn how to train, because just the fact that it was trainable was a very big issue to Bob. His point in all of this was to not be the weird old guy who had these strange experiences, but to put this out-of-body experience on the map scientifically. He wanted to be legitimate. He didn't want this to be a strange thing. He wanted to be legitimate. So that's why he was going to do this research, to find out what was this, could you teach others to do it, could you teach naive people to do it. So it didn't take 2 years. These are the things he wanted to do. So we did evidential things because we had to prove to ourselves that this was real. So we would remote view and then immediately call the place where we remote viewed. It'd usually be somebody's home that we had made this arrangement with, and try to tell them what we saw them doing at that particular time. We would try diagnosing illnesses of people that we knew, or that somebody knew that we didn't know, but somebody knew that had a particular illness. We tried going to the future and bringing back information and then seeing if it happened. We tried going to the past and getting information and seeing if we could find it verified in the historical record. We did lots of things like that. Bob would write numbers on the blackboard while we were out about it, and we would try to read them, and so on and so on. We did this for years and years in order to determine whether what we were doing was real in the sense of outside of us, or whether it was just our imagination inside of us. That's a critical thing that you have to determine. If you can't make that determination, then you really have a hard time determining whether you are making it up or whether you're actually getting data from outside of you. Well, the thing that really changed my attitude, I mean, I had a good attitude there, but what really made a big impact on me is that even though we've been doing this stuff and we've been keeping statistics, and the chances of the data that we were getting being random, in other words, you were just lucky, you guessed right answers, the probability of random successes that we were getting was close to 1 in a million. You know, so statistically and as a scientist, I could look at that and say, this is real. You know, something real is going on here. It's 1 in a million that we would be getting this data just because we were good guessers or we were lucky. But even knowing that intellectually, you still don't believe it at a deep level because it's just so far out of your experience. Well, what happened to change that for me was that Bob one day came up with a new experiment. He said, I want you and Dennis to go out of body together. I want you to meet somewhere outside of this reality, and I want you to go on an adventure and then come back and report as you go. Now, the way he had us trained was there was a microphone. We were lying down in a waterbed in 3 little rooms that were electromagnetically isolated. They were acoustically isolated. And there were 3 rooms. I got in the first room. Dennis was in the 3rd room. So there was an empty room between us. And the isolation was really good. You could not hear, maybe if somebody screamed, you could hear that a little muffled noise, but it was very good isolation. So we were lying there in these heated water beds with a microphone in front of our lips, and he had trained us to go out of body and then basically suspend that state, come back, report, go back. And we got to where that was natural. We could do that. You didn't lose the state. It was like multiprocessing. Right? You could just doing 2 things at once. Actually, you were just splitting your reality. It was a parallel processing thing. You were still there, but you were here too. But your focus slipped back to here. You could talk, go back to there. And so Dennis and I did that. We met above the lab in the air. We went on a journey. We talked to each other. We had conversations. We met entities we had conversations with. We went places, did things, saw people. It was very interesting and very kind of detailed thing. It wasn't one of these, a good time was had by all, and you couldn't really differentiate it. It was quite an adventure like we usually had. Lasted about an hour and a half, as usual, to 2 hours. We came back, and Bob greeted us with his usual little sardonic grin that you couldn't tell exactly what he meant. He had a way of keeping you guessing. And he asked us, he says, well, do you 2 think you really were together? And we looked at each other and said, well, it seemed that way. So he said, well, listen to this. And he put the 2 tapes on that he had recorded from each of us talking on his microphones, and flipped the 2 switches so that they would run together. And there was a conversation of Dennis and I talking to each other, answering each other's questions, saying, oh, do you see that? Yes, I see that. And we were talking about what we saw. We interacted with other people. So it sounded like 2 people who were together having a conversation, which is what it was. It just wasn't happening in this reality. Well, that was a sea state change for me. I went home after that and I tried to think, well, how else can we explain that? How else could this have happened? I said, well, maybe one of us had the experience and the other one was just picking up on their thoughts, And then it was, well, no, that wouldn't happen. We were having conversations. It wasn't just picking up on their thoughts. There was no other explanation. and then it's like a ton of bricks. And I spent the next 3 weeks going, oh my God, it's real. Oh my God. And I said that over and over and over again until it finally sunk in that it was. And at that point, then a fire was lit in me to find out, how did this reality work? What was its physics? What was its rules? What was its causality? I mean, there's another reality. You know, realities have causality. They have rules of things you can do and can't do. What's there? What are the limits? What else is out there? How far does this reality go? You know, it's all those questions. That's what physicists do. They try to understand reality. So I was on a mission from that point to do that, and I've been on that mission ever since. So, excuse me. Learning accelerates. You know, the more you know, the easier it is to know more. So you keep working at this, and you find that it's not just about finding out information. It's not just about exploring other realities. It's about growing up. It's about changing who you are. It's about being. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's something you have to experience. It's something you have to be. So you don't just study this like you would study, you know, fruit flies or earthworms or, you know, some sort of scientific experiment. You have to study this from the inside. You have to experiment and do those experiments to try to answer these questions. And you always have to be looking for evidence so you don't wander down some path inside your own head and imagination and think that you're actually doing something real. You know, that's a hazard that you have to always be careful to do. Now, you can't get evidence on everything. Obviously, you're going in another reality system. Sometimes there is no evidence. But you have to collect enough evidence on things that are associated with this reality that you can then make a check to where you know what you're doing. And once you know what you're doing, you can extrapolate that to other things. And you collect evidence wherever you can, and you take your best judgment where you can't. Of course, science does that all the time. You know, science, Rutherford discovered that atoms had positive charge at their center and were empty otherwise. Well, they measured some atoms, but they didn't have to measure every atom. It's not like, well, we're not sure yet because, you know, we haven't measured every atom in the universe. We think that's the way it is. You know, you can measure some. You get to a point where you come to general understandings and general things, and you can make the argument that, well, this is just like that. So that's kind of, we do the same thing. Okay, now one other comment. Since my background started in this, in out of body, I'll have to kind of make a comment here. Out of body is one very small part of the larger reality. That's not the larger reality. That's just a little piece of it. My analogy to you would be that if you were born in a house that had no windows, it had doors but you couldn't open them, or maybe you never tried to open them. And that would be like being in this physical matter reality. You just lived in this house and that was it. That was your whole reality, was inside that house. And then one day, you opened the door to the backyard and walked outside. Wow, you could see maybe, 100 yards in several directions. You could see the neighbor's yards, you could see the critters playing, the squirrels in the trees. And what a big expansion on your reality. You could see blue sky, all sorts of things that weren't in your house. And that was amazing. And you thought now you knew everything that existed. But of course, it's just your backyard. You can't see the rest of your neighborhood. You can't see the city you live in. You don't know anything about the county, the state, the country, or the world. All that's out there. But you've just increased your reality immensely by stepping out into the backyard. That's the way out of body is. It's one reality frame. It's one small piece of a larger whole. So though I got my start there, that was just the launching pad. After I kind of left working with Bob Monroe, and Dennis and I both kind of slipped out the back when we became well-known and kind of successful. Dennis had read an old scientific, well, it wasn't old then, it is now. He read a Scientific American article that talked about binaural beats. And we were trying to do anything we could to train brainwaves so that we could teach people, so that we could teach people to get into the appropriate altered states without a lot of training. They didn't have to know how to meditate. They didn't have to do anything. We just could, we wanted to be able to do that. So we were looking for ways to do that. So Dennis said, well, let's try this binaural beat, and we'll put it 4 hertz on a binaural beat, and we'll see what happens. Well, we played with it. Bob was out of town at that time. We played with it for about a week and found out, wow, this really works. It drives EEG. We had an EEG monitor, and we'd play these beats on each other, and it would just drive the EEG right into a nice 4 hertz. And it did succeed, and that's what turned out, of course, some years later to be HemiSync. That's the HemiSync technology. So once we had that, and we started inviting people as test subjects to see if we could make a naive subject have an out-of-body experience by doing this, word got around, and pretty soon, instead of doing research, we were trainers. We had so many people knocking on the door that all we could do was to keep up with the crowd that wanted to come in, and we weren't really there to be trainers. So we trained other trainers to be trainers, and we kind of slipped out because that was the kind of the new focus that where the research was going at that particular time. Okay. Now let's talk about, I might tell you something about these slides. Bob said that I would, and I didn't, so I should tell you. I didn't know until the day before I got on the airplane that we would be able to show slides here, and I assumed that we wouldn't. So I didn't make any pictures. I don't have any pretty pictures for you. All I have is words. Fortunately, I do my own notes in PowerPoint, so you get to watch my notes. The slides have a couple of values. One, they're part of the record, and that's why I make them detailed. I intend to leave them. You can get them at my website. You can download them, or you can get them from INAX, from Bob. So if you want a copy of these slides, they're available to you. That way it leaves you with something more tangible than your memory. So that's the main reason that I do them in PowerPoint, so I can hand them out at the end. The other major value is that it'll give you something else to look at besides me, and that's not a real small value. Okay, excuse me. My Big T.O.E. It's a model of reality, existence, consciousness in the physical world. Now, this is important. Don't confuse the model of reality with reality, okay? Don't confuse the model of reality with reality. Physicists make models that map causes and effects within a subset of reality. That's what physics is, okay? Physicists model reality with mathematics. Don't confuse the model with what is being modeled. They're very different. Now, physicists often lose sight of that. And pretty soon, the model becomes the reality. It's a stand-in for the reality. And then pretty soon after that, they begin to believe that the model is the truth. And then pretty soon after that, they believe that anything that isn't the model is foolish. So that's an error of process. Now that's a little abstract. So let me do another similar thing that's a little less abstract and say, don't confuse the map with the territory. See, it's the same sort of thing. Now, no matter how detailed that map is, it could be very detailed. It can have every tree and blade of grass and every grain of sand in that map. It's still not the territory. Okay? There's a difference. There's a difference between the model and what's being modeled. Okay, maps are just a characterization of something more fundamental. So are models. Okay. Physics describes how things work, not what things are. Okay, that's sort of the difference between the model and the reality. Okay, physics describes the map. The map is only a characterization. So that's kind of an important thing to know. Okay, now we should never believe that reality is constrained to fit our model. Reality is not constrained to fit our model. Second point. Okay, and that's another reason for being open-minded. It's almost like somebody believing their own press reports or beginning to believe their own resume. You have to be a little circumspect about believing the fundamental reality of your model. Models are not fundamental, and they're not fundamental reality. They're just models, and my model's like that too. It's just a model. So don't confuse the model of reality with reality. Now, a model or a theory is valuable if it has 4 attributes. 1, it has to have the fewest possible assumptions. If you need a lot of assumptions to prop up your theory, it's probably not true, and it's certainly not fundamental. Truth is elegant. It has to derive all the old answers. So you have to be able to say everything that we knew before as for certain. You still have to be able to drive those answers. It has to drive new answers that the old one couldn't do. And those new answers have to be shown to be correct experimentally, provide good, credible answers to currently unanswerable questions. If your theory does that, or your model does that, then we say it's a good model. Okay, that doesn't mean that we say that it is reality and reality works just like the model. We just say it's a good model. It's a productive model. It's a model that we can use. Okay, now My Big T.O.E. as a model of reality meets all those criteria very well. To point out where I'm going with this discussion, I want to tell you an old physics joke. This is the joke that the theorists tell about the experimentalists. But I've adapted the joke to a story because the very worst thing in the world is to have to listen to an introvert tell a joke. I know my limitations. Okay, here's the story. There were a few scientists researching the hypothesis that an anacrid's acoustic sensors were on its legs. That means a spider, say, can hear with sense organs on its legs. Okay, these experimentalists trained a spider to jump whenever a bell was rung. And they trained the spider so well that it was 100% sure that if the bell was rung, the spider would jump. Ring the bell, spider jumps. Ring the bell, spider jumps. Well, now came the experiment. They pulled a leg off the spider and rang the bell. The spider jumped. They pulled another leg off the spider, rang the bell, spider jumped. And so on, we progress until they pulled the very last leg off that spider and they rang the bell, and the spider just sat there. And the scientist said, "Eureka! That proves it. Without its legs, the spider is deaf." You see, the point of that is it's those fundamental assumptions that get you. It's those fundamental assumptions that trip you up. Well, science has a fundamental assumption that's wrong. And basically, it's the assumption that there is no territory. That the physical mapping of cause and effect through mathematical modeling is all there is to reality. That defines reality. If you can't measure it, you can't weigh it, it's irrelevant and not real. It's called an operational definition of reality. That there is no larger causality that supports and defines physical reality. There is no scientific justification for that assumption. That's just a belief. There's no justification for that assumption. How can there be justification that there is no larger reality if you cannot get into a larger reality to see if there is a larger reality? It's just a belief. Reality is layered. It's system within system. The subset cannot define the superset. Okay? You have consciousness as the superset. This physical reality is a subset. The information in the subset cannot define the superset. It's very simple. It's a very easy thing to understand. You can't define the big thing with just part of the information. Right? And as simple as that seems to be, an awful lot of scientists miss that point. Okay, now, so we have now consciousness supporting and maintaining the physical matter, the subset, consciousness, the superset. Now, do all scientists think that these are crazy ideas? Physical matter is just a subset of a larger superset of consciousness? No. In fact, the very best scientists that we have do not think these are crazy ideas. Okay, takes us to one of my favorite people, who's Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, the last 23 years of his life, worked on a thing called unified field theory. It was a TOE. It was the very first scientific TOE. And he wanted unified field theory to be one theory, one set of equations, because he was still tied to a physical viewpoint, that explained all science, all physics, everything explained with these other equations. So he tried to pick apart the fundamentals of reality and describe them. Well, here's some quotes from Albert Einstein. He says, if we think of the field, and that's his unified field theory, as being removed, there is no space which remains, since space does not have an independent existence. Okay? Now, this is not some crazy physicist from Huntsville, Alabama saying this. This is Albert Einstein. This is probably the best scientist that our genetic pool has produced in the last couple of centuries. And he said, reality is merely an illusion, a very persistent one. He said, it's clear that the space of physics is not, in the last analysis, anything given in nature or independent of human thought. It's a function of our conceptual scheme. That means space is a function of mind. Space, as conceived by Newton, proved to be an illusion, although, of course, a very fruitful illusion. Okay, now, one of the co-workers in this unified field theory was another very top-notch physicist, very highly regarded. And here's some things that he said about it. To meet the challenge before us, our notions of cosmology and the general nature of reality must have room in them to permit a consistent account of consciousness. Vice versa, our notions of consciousness must have room in them to understand what it means for its content to be reality as a whole, for the content of consciousness to be reality of a whole. Okay, now this isn't some guy sitting on a stool in a New Age, fair. This is David Bohm, physicist extraordinaire. This is Albert Einstein. Okay, here's a letter from Einstein to Bohm. One has to find a possibility to avoid the continuum together with space and time altogether. But I have not the slightest idea what kind of elementary concepts could be used in such a theory. And that was written October 28, 1954. Now, we think science has gone a long way since 1954, but in this particular case, it's actually backed up. And the reason it's backed up is if you're a scientist and you run into a wall that even the best of the best can't get through or can't find a door in it, then what do you do about that? You turn around and go some other direction. You forget about it. You don't go there anymore. And to try to go there and bang your head against that wall that Einstein couldn't crack is like a career killer. There's just no point because it can't be cracked. Well, so that whole understanding that consciousness was at the root of reality kind of evaporated over time because nobody went there, and it was seen as an unproductive place to go. Okay, now here's a quote from Eugene Wigner. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He also was one of the leading physicists of the time back when quantum mechanics was being invented and put together. He said, "It will remain remarkable in whatever way our future concepts may develop that the very study of the external world," and now he meant the study of quantum mechanics, "led to the scientific conclusion that the content of the consciousness is the ultimate universal reality." Okay? It's a Nobel Prize winning physicist who was instrumental in developing quantum mechanics in the first place. And these kinds of ideas at that time, back in the 30s, were not seen as unusual or even particularly far out, because that's where science led. That's the doorstep. It went right up to that point, and that's where it led. And a lot of scientists at that time came to that conclusion, but again, that was a wall they couldn't penetrate, so they went elsewhere, someplace that they could penetrate. Well, let's do a summary on what we've heard from these scientists, and that is that time and space are not continuous. Einstein realized that. He couldn't make it with continuous solutions. He was at a time in 1954 where digital science didn't exist yet. That was outside of his reality frame. Okay? Physical reality is an illusion, does not exist independently, and it's a mental construct. Consciousness is somehow at the root of reality. And the relationship between physical reality and consciousness is very fundamental but unknown. That's kind of the summary of where these scientists got to. They knew the traditional fundamental assumptions about reality were wrong, but they just didn't know what to do about it. Okay, now what's the problem? Why did Einstein and Bohm and the others get stuck? Well, they had three beliefs that locked the door. One is they were looking only for continuous solutions. Reality, space, and time comes in discrete units. It's digital. Okay, now we know that about everything else. We know this lectern here is actually discrete units, right? They're called molecules, and the molecules are in discrete units called atoms, and the atoms are in discrete units called elementary particles. And there's space between these discrete units. I mean, we know that everything in our physical world comes in discrete units at its root, but somehow time and space escape that conclusion. Well, fact is, time and space are discrete, just like everything else. They come in discrete units. Now, back in the early days of quantum mechanics, that was an idea that was current then. And there's a length called Planck's length. That's about, I think, 10 to the minus 36 meters or so. That was supposed to be how small you could get before space became granular. But again, that was another idea they really didn't know what to do with. They kind of walked away from that one. But then, let me finish this one. They were looking for the physical reality to be fundamental. They just, physical reality was it. They weren't looking for anything bigger. They weren't looking for a superset. They wanted just this physical reality because that's all the reality there was. And that was the only objective reality that there could be. So they wanted it to be fundamental, not derivative. Well, objective physical reality constitutes a subset of a larger consciousness system. It's a virtual digital reality. Third, they were looking for an objective solution, something that you can put in a jar, put under a microscope, measure. Consciousness is fundamentally personal. It's not objective in the sense of these individuals trying to go out and measure it like they'd measure the weight of a rock. Okay? Consciousness must be experienced from the inside. One learns little of its fundamental nature by probing it from the outside. You can ask other people questions about their consciousness all day and you're not going to learn a whole lot about consciousness. That's not the way. This is fundamentally personal, and it is not objective in the sense that they were looking for objective things. It's subjective. Okay, now a little bit about objective and subjective. The physical world here, we say, well, this is objective. We know this is here. We all look at it and we all say, here this is, it's wood, it's brown, and here's how heavy it is, and here what it weighs. This is not really as objective as we think. We just think this is subjective because all of our sensors are so similar. Everybody out here sees in the same narrow band of wavelengths. Everybody hears in the same narrow band of acoustic vibrations. All our sensors are so similar that we all agree with what we see. Okay, so we say that's objective, but actually it's not objective. It's subjective. It's just the subjective nature of it is very, very small. It's in the margins, so we don't notice it. But the reason it's subjective is that when people look at this, they get the data, right? Data comes from light. Light comes in particles. It's digital. They get the data. It goes into the optic nerve. They get neurons. There's another thing. It's digital. It's individual little chunks. They get information, and that information has to be interpreted. You don't just, your awareness of something has to be interpreted. Your interpretation is not objective. Your interpretation is subjective. So if you look at the detail, even this is subjective because you have to interpret what those neurons mean. And everybody interprets it differently. That's why 5 people standing shoulder to shoulder on a street corner see an accident, they all report a different story. They all got exactly the same data. The same light particles hit their eyes, you know. Their sensory equipment's all very similar. They get the same kind of neuron patterns. You know, all that was the same. And they all report different stories because they interpret it differently. Well, what's the difference there then between that accident and this thing? And between consciousness? Well, with consciousness, it's just data. Think of a consciousness as just something that's aware and receives data. And the data comes in and you have to interpret it. Well, it's not a matter of everybody's sensors and everybody's interpretation being the same. Everybody's interpretation is just different. Just as different as people are different. Depends on your background, depends on your beliefs, depends on what you know and how much you understand. Your interpretations are different. Okay, so that's consciousness is data. You interpret it. It's subjective. This too is data. You interpret it, and it's subjective. But our tools, our sensors, are all so close together that we say, well, it's objective. That's just because we agree. When it's only data about relationship, or data in a conversation, or data looking at an accident, then that subjectivity is major, not minor. The subjective part is the big part. Now, there is something objective behind that data. The data came from somewhere, right? The data was intended from someplace. There's an objective thing there, but that's the territory. All you get to do is make the map. All you get to do is interpret what that data means. You don't get to walk the territory. So that's kind of the nature of consciousness. And when I talk about the subjective and objective, you realize everything's subjective. It's just that the limits to this that's subjective is very small because of our sensors. In consciousness, the limits that's subjective is very big. All right. So now comes Edward Fredkin on the scene in 1992. He wrote a couple of papers. One was called Finite Nature, the other A New Cosmogony. And he presented these papers to science forums. These were not published in, New Age magazine. He stood up in front of a bunch of physicists and other scientists, and he had equations to back up his results. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stood up. Now, Edward Fredkin is no small weight either. He is not Albert Einstein, but he's up in that rarefied area. He's a very highly renowned physicist, still working as a physicist. This is not that long ago. He came to the conclusion from the study of information theory that reality is, one, either a computer itself, which is an interesting conclusion. He thought about that and said, well, physical reality, that doesn't fit, that it's a computer itself. No, that doesn't compute. So he then dropped down to that reality, physical reality, is implemented on a computer. That means physical reality is a simulation, digital simulation. He also showed that time and space were digital, part of Einstein's problem. He tried to do it continuously. So he presented this information, said that reality is just information. It's just information. And of course he knew that a simulation cannot compute itself. So that was kind of a logical problem for him. Well, if it's computed, where is it computed from? It can't compute itself. So he said, I don't know. He says, my equations don't take me there. They don't explain that to me, but they do tell me that space is digital, time's digital, and reality is a digital simulation. He says, so what I'm going to tell you is that it's just computed in other. And that was his term that he used in his paper. And that was just a fill-in because he didn't know what else to say about it. So it's computed in other. Well, now listen, if we define physical reality as this universe, physical reality, and it's computed in other, where's other? Other has to be outside of this physical reality. And what do we call that, if we're being honest? We call that non-physical. You can't get a scientist to stand up and say the word non-physical because that's not politically correct. So they'll say in some other physical reality, but not this physical reality. Well, that's kind of cheating with the words, isn't it? If it's not in this physical reality, then basically we're talking about it's non-physical. You have a physical reality here, and everything else we call non-physical because it's outside of this physical reality, and it's non-physical to us. Okay, so the here you had Einstein doing this. Now, you know, that was in the 50s. Now in 1992, you have another guy coming from a different angle. He's come to the same result, except now he's beaten the digital, he's beaten the continuous problem and so on. He's gotten a step up on it, but he still doesn't understand that consciousness is the computer. His first logical step was reality could be the computer itself. Well, he was right. If he was looking at the larger reality, which is consciousness, it is the computer itself. Okay, but the physical is just a simulation. It's a subset. If you like, it's a multiplayer game being run on a larger server. Okay, the next guy that kind of I'm quoting here is Nick Bostrom. He has degrees in philosophy and in physics, both, advanced degrees in both of those subjects. He's a chairman of a department at Oxford, not a lightweight guy, very highly respected. He wrote a paper called Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? And he said that one of these things must be true. And he used logic, both with his physics and his philosophy, to decide what. His first thing, either it's impossible, and after study he said it's impossible to say that it's impossible. Then he said if it's not impossible, then it's unlikely. Further study, he said it's unlikely to say that it's unlikely. Then he said, well, if it's not unlikely, it's almost certain that all entities within our general set of experiences are living in a simulation. Okay, now here's a guy that approaches it from philosophy and logic with a physics background. Now you have Brian Whitworth. He's the last one to publish. He's not in the same esteemed group as Einstein and Fredkin and Bohm and Bostrom. He's not actually a physicist, he's a mathematician. He works in the Center for Discrete Mathematics and Theoretical Computer Science. What he did is he said, okay, guys, I'm not going to worry about where this other is or why reality might be digital simulation. He says, I'm not going to worry about any of that. I just want to see, is that a good assumption or not? You know, there's 4 things I said you have to have before a theory is good. He says, let's go apply those 4 things and see how it does compared to what we got now. He did that, and the result of his paper was assuming that we have a digital virtual reality to represent physical matter reality satisfies what we know about the world, what we know about physics, better than the assumption that we have now, which is, oh, it's just here because it's here. That's basically where physics is now. This physical matter reality is here because it is here. Well, it came from the Big Bang. Well, where did the Big Bang come from? What was before that, and so on. And it's just, this is the way it is. You know, there is no explanation. It's like you start there, it's a given in physics. You start with the physical reality and you don't have an explanation. So he looked at that. He looked at, you know, all the modern science we had. He compared. He says, well, if you have this assumption, you get these things. You have that assumption, you get these. And this does this well, and this does this, you know, poorly. And his result was, physicists, you guys got to wake up. Look at this. It's perfectly clear, even to me, a mathematician, that the assumption of a digital virtual reality is a better assumption. It describes the facts that you guys have found better than the assumption that you're using. And that paper's on the web. You can find it. It's not too heavily laden with mathematics. Okay, so what do we have? So we've come to the point now that it's not necessarily a heretical idea to say that consciousness is the larger reality, and that physics, you know, that the physical reality is a virtual digital reality. We see some pretty heavyweight scientists leading in that direction, from Einstein up through Fredkin. Okay, what we have now is that consciousness is the fundamental reality. The larger consciousness reality is a digital system. We know at the most fundamental level, consciousness is information. Okay, information, the most fundamental level is bits. Bits at the most fundamental level are binary. Information is non-physical and subjective. Thus consciousness is non-physical and subjective. And you're thinking, information is non-physical? We got information all over the place. You know, we're overloaded with information. Well, information is non-physical. That's because information is the meaning, the content, the message, not the media, not the code symbols. Okay, if you look at a book, information isn't the paper, information isn't the ink. Information isn't the words, those are just symbols. It takes a consciousness to get the information. Okay? Information requires a consciousness. Now you can store information and you can code information, that's true, but you can't put information in a bottle. Anything physical you can put in a bottle, an imaginary bottle. But you can't put information in a bottle, you can put a book in a bottle, but you can't put information in a bottle. Information is understanding. It's the message. It's non-physical because it requires a consciousness to get it, to get the message. Okay, understanding requires a subjective interpretation of the data relative to personal experience. That subjective interpretation has to come relative to your own personal experience. Okay, information in a digital system is represented by organized bits. That's what we've just said. Information systems have entropy. Now that's, if you were a scientist, particularly an information scientist, you would say, yeah, information systems have entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. It's a measure of an ability to do something, do work. So if you have high entropy, you have high disorder, you have randomness. In communications, that means you have noise in your signal. Okay, when you lower that entropy, you have more information, less noise. It's more highly organized. Okay, now here's an example of entropy for those of you that aren't familiar with the term. You have an automobile, and while that automobile is put together, it has a lot of parts, probably thousands of parts. And if you have that automobile all put together, you can do a lot of things with it. You can drive around in it, you can crash into things, break things, you can use it as a nutcracker if you put nuts under the wheels. There's lots of things you can do with it. But let's take all the parts apart, every washer, every nut, every bolt, everything, every wire, and let's lay it in a big pile in a front yard. Now, I'm from Alabama, so I can say that. You lay it in a big pile in a front yard. That's what we do in Alabama. And when you have that big pile of parts, now you have very high entropy in that system that was the car. Before, you had all that order in the parts and how they related to each other. Now you have no order. They're just randomly tossed in a big pile in the front yard. Now, what can that pile of parts do? Well, not nearly as much as it could do before. About all it can do is kill your grass, right? It can't really accomplish anything. It can't even crack nuts. So that means you've gone from a lower entropy system to a higher entropy system. That's one measure of entropy. So it does two things. It's a measure of disorder, or a measure of organization, if you will, and it's a measure of an ability to do work. All right, so all information systems, all systems, have entropy. Information systems have entropy as well. Now, greater level of organization, less randomness, noise. Okay, we've done that, automobile parts. Okay, systems evolve to be more successful within their environments. Okay, evolve. Now we're talking about evolution. Any system has entropy. If that system is going to evolve, that fundamentally means the system has to decrease its entropy, it has to get more organized. It has to somehow do things better than it did before. Okay, so a system evolves by lowering its entropy. A system has really three choices. It can evolve, it can stay the same, or it can de-evolve, or de-evolve, which means get higher entropy. Well, a large complex system, simple systems have those choices. A very large complex system only has two choices, because stasis, which is the one in the middle, not changing, isn't an option. It's unstable. You can't take a large complex system that's very interactive and make it just stay the same. It doesn't stay the same. It'll always change. So now it just has two choices. It can either evolve, decrease its entropy, or de-evolve and increase its entropy. That's another way of saying it can grow or it can die. So those are the only choices the system can do. Okay, systems evolve to be more successful within their environments. Now, large, complex information systems evolve by lowering their entropy. Think of technology, think of the economy, think of General Motors, think of any large system. It evolves, and it does that by lowering its entropy. You know, that's just the way it is. So I'm not talking, when I say evolution, I'm not talking about biological evolution. That's just kind of one particular example. I'm talking about something really different than that, a larger, more fundamental sense of the word evolution than just biological evolution. Okay, so consciousness is a self-aware, self-modifying system evolving toward lower entropy states. Okay, consciousness, large and complex, it's a real system. Because it's a real system, it has to be a finite system. Real systems aren't infinite. Now, many of you probably had a belief that says, well, the big consciousness system, the big thing out there of which we're all a part is infinite. It's not infinite. Infinite systems are make-believe systems. Infinite is a number you can't get to. It's imaginary. Real systems are finite, okay? Because if you have infinite systems, they require infinite energy and infinite process and all sorts of other things that are impossible to do. So consciousness is a finite system. Well, when you say that, then it's like, well, what's on the other? What's that?
Sorry,
Tom?
I think I forgot to mention earlier, I think Steve needed a quick break.
No, we're okay with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good.
So, let's see where we well, all right, attributes, we're going to start over here, I guess. Consciousness system is a real system, therefore it's a finite system. Now when we talk about, well, what's beyond it then? If it's finite, that means it has a boundary, right? And then what else? Well, this is where you have to understand that there are limits to knowledge. You can't know everything. I know that's upsetting. You want to know everything, but you can't know everything. And the example I used it the other night, it's a good example of why you can't know everything, is look at the example of an intestinal bacterium. Okay, you get a bacterium in your intestine, and the most important thing in its existence is food. Now, it can know a few things about its environment, but can it know where the food comes from? Can it know about sunshine and rain and plows and tractors and, horses and cows and seeds and all that sort of thing? It can't. There's no way it can do that unless it can get out into that larger reality. It's stuck with a view that's local. Okay? It's stuck in its reality system. Well, we're like that bacterium. There are limits. Now, does that mean that the stuff that's beyond your limit to know isn't important? No. Is rain and sunshine and grocery stores important to that bacterium? Yeah, that's where it gets its food from. It's very important. Its whole existence depends on it, but can it know anything about it? No. Okay? We're in that same position. But we're a little smarter than a bacterium. Some of us are a little smarter than a bacterium, right? You probably know some people that you'd quibble with that on, but we are smarter than a bacterium. So we can actually get out of the box. We have consciousness. We can get into that larger system, and that's the only way to know anything about that system is to get into it. You have to get out of this reality box and get into a larger reality with your awareness in order to know anything about it. And because it's all your consciousness and it's individual and it's subjective, you have to do it. Reading about it, it's not an intellectual exercise, it's an experiential exercise. Okay, so if we look at these kind of attributes of consciousness, we say it's got input, right? Data comes in. It's got memory. You have to have memory. If you don't have memory, every experience is your first, and you can't progress that way. You have to have processing, which means you have to be able to compare states. Otherwise, how do you know if you're getting better or getting worse? You need to have some processing to be able to say, oh, I like this better, let's go this way. And you have to have purpose, because that's the criteria of better and worse. It's what the purpose is. Okay, and you have to be self-modifying. So you have to be able to look at that purpose, look at your processing of your memory that you got from the input, and then change the way you develop input. Change yourself. Okay, and if you think about that, those are the attributes of consciousness. They're also the attributes of anything that's alive. Think of that first biological cell sitting in a primordial sea somewhere. It had input. It had to be able to experience its environment. It had to have memory. Now it didn't have a cerebrum and a brain and all that, but its memory was in its genetics, in its DNA. It had memory just the same. It was biological memory, if you will. It had processing. It had to know whether this state was better or worse. Was the change that I made an improvement or not? And it had to have purpose. Well, its purpose, like all biological purposes, is procreation and survival. So that made its purpose. Consciousness purpose is lower your entropy. Okay, so we see that life is defined by these very things. Well, what else is defined by these things? What does this remind you of? Input, memory, processing, right? Self-modifying kind of sounds like a desktop, doesn't it? Sounds like a digital data system. Same sort of thing, except we're not really good about the self-modifying yet. We do it a little. Our computers are a little self-modifying. When you put that CD in, your computer knows to go get the software that loads, audio decoding. You don't have to tell it to do that. It recognizes things. It makes decisions. Oh, I got to go do this, and it goes do it, and you do other things. So there's a little bit of self-motivation there, but it's very, very, very diminutive, very, very tiny. So we haven't reached the point where our computers are conscious yet. And purpose. What's the purpose? Well, the purpose in your computer, of course, is what it is you tell it to do. You give it an instruction, and then that's its purpose. That it has to find ways to solve your purpose. All right. Summary. Consciousness is best modeled as a superset, a self-modifying digital information system capable of computing virtual realities. The larger consciousness system evolves by lowering the entropy of the system. It lowers the entropy of the system by organizing bits at its disposal in a more profitable configuration. Content creation and reorganization opportunities are generated by using consciousness intent to apply free will choice to incoming experience data. Feedback of the results of the previous choice allows us to modify future choices, and that little arrow says that that's a loop. You keep looping through those bottom three bullets. Okay? Next. So experience was a key here. Generating experience. Because experience is how you generate input. That's where the input comes from. The input is defined as experience, right? That's where you get the data. Okay? Consciousness facilitates its own evolution by creating many smaller subunits of consciousness, setting them loose to evolve, lower their entropy by interacting with each other with free will. Now, what are these little subsets? Well, that's us, right? Little chunks of consciousness. We're interacting. Now, why would this consciousness system do that? Now, we're not talking about magic here or somebody that says, aha, let's do that, let's break these up. We're talking about a system that evolves. This is a way that it improves the rate at which you can reduce entropy. So it's a state that it gets to, like anything else evolves. Right? So it evolves to this state, and it finds that if it's just one consciousness, what does it interact with? Itself. Very limiting. Even if it liked itself, it's still very limiting. So even if it's a good conversationalist, right, it would be very limiting. So you have to have something richer than just interacting with yourself. So that's why it evolves into lots of pieces that interact with each other. Now, why with free will? Well, you don't have consciousness without free will. You don't have free will without consciousness. The two of them are requisites of each other. Okay? If you're sharing data in order to have experience, in order to learn and lower your entropy, you can't learn if you don't have free will. If it's deterministic, you're just following a script. There's no learning going on. Determinism doesn't allow for learning, doesn't allow for entropy reduction. It just allows for following a script. Okay? And on the other hand, you just have randomness. Well, obviously nothing gets done. in randomness. You don't end up anywhere. There's no forward direction to the evolution if it's just randomness. Okay, so what we have now is that the purpose and the positive direction of that purpose, we've defined it. Okay, positive and negative we defined, good and bad, good and evil, all those things are defined now in terms of entropy, evolution, consciousness, morality, spiritual growth, love, are all defined as measurable quantities in terms of entropy. Okay? Now, what is love? It's the nature of a low entropy consciousness. It's not that low entropy consciousness is loving or loves everybody or everything. It's that a low entropy consciousness, and we're saying in sort of in the limit as entropy approaches zero, a low entropy consciousness is love. That's the nature. It's what we define as love. Okay, experience requires interaction. To make the interaction more effective, a simpler, constrained environment is needed. Okay, now what's that? That's our local physical reality, isn't it? Okay, you need rules to constrain something to get some traction on this. Now think of it, you're just consciousness, and consciousness is just sharing data. Just digital data is coming back and forth to you, and you're interpreting it. How do you grow from that? What do you make of it? Do you know that data you're getting didn't just come from some insane, fragment of consciousness somewhere, or is trying to trick you or whatever? You don't have any traction. It's just data being passed, and you don't have any way of judging or interacting. So you need rules. You need a rule set that confines this. The rules make the game. If you have an athletic game and no rules, it's not a very interesting game. Right? You have to have rules to make the game. Well, the rule set is physics. That's our physical matter reality physics. It's called the rule set. So you have this rule set, and then you let this multiplayer digital simulation run according to that rule set called physics. And here we are, and we're bound by that rule set, by the physics. We have gravity, and we have all these other rules that, two things don't occupy the same space at the same time, and all the things that Newton and Einstein and others said. That's part of our rule set. And what physicists generally do for a career is determine what the rule set is. They're digging out the rule set. Okay, so this physical reality, why would you do that? Because it helps the interaction, it gives it traction, it gives it feedback because of the rules. You've got a real game going now, not just something that's uncontrollable. You end up with a virtual learning lab for individual pieces of consciousness. That's what our physical reality is. Now we have purpose. Why are we here? What's this reality for? So we can learn, so we can grow, so we can become love, low entropy. We're evolving. So that's now the purpose of this reality frame and the purpose of our life. Okay, so physical reality is digital-based, virtual reality where interactions are constrained according to physics. And the next level of relativity is this, and that is that there is no absolute fundamental reality system. Now, Einstein came up with relativity, and the reason it was called relativity was he said that there is no fundamental inertial frame. That was the big core of relativity. And that means that your sense of space and time is relative. Therefore, call it relativity. It depends on where you are and the motion that you have relative to some other observer. So it's relative to the observer. No fundamental inertial frame. Well, the next relativity at the next higher level says there is no fundamental reality frame. Now what this means is that our reality is physical to us because we're here. So from our point of view, this is physical. When you're in another reality frame that's not this one, guess what? It appears physical, and this one doesn't. See, there's no fundamental reality frame. So whether it's physical or non-physical is just your point of view. It's relative to the observer. All frames are basically the same. None of them are fundamental. So these non-physical frames, they're not a whole lot different as far as their fundamental nature goes than this frame. When you're in them, they're physical, and when you're in them, this is not physical. When you're in this one, it seems physical. So it's just a matter of perspective. You get into a rule set, and the rule set defines what's physical. You get into a different rule set in a different frame, that defines what's physical in that frame. So you say there is no fundamental reality. I hate to tell you that, this reality that you love so much, is not fundamental, and is not the one that everyone else is, working with or toward, but it's not. Okay, so now we talk about multiple virtual realities. I break these virtual realities into two categories. There's those that are constrained a lot. Okay, they have a lot of constraints. That's like this one. That's physical matter. We have a lot of constraints here, a lot of rules to follow, a lot of physics we have to abide by, a lot of equations we have to satisfy. And then there are those physical reality, or those other realities that have very few rules. Now, each physical reality evolves its own kind of stuff, its own kind of beings, its own kind of chunks of consciousness, and they interact in their own physics and their own rule sets. Okay, so when you have physical kind of realities, some of those to us are non-physical. Now, see, I have gone in my exploration of consciousness, I have run across, maybe 20, 30 other physical realities that were highly constrained realities like this one. And they are similar to this, but different. Different rules, but for the most part similar, because these rules are effective as far as defining a game where you can learn. So differences, but similar. I mean, some are very different as far as what the interactions and what's there, but I'm saying that they're the same in a sense fundamentally. From a fundamental viewpoint, they're very similar, even though the beings and how the beings interact and other things could be vastly different. That's like you have vastly different critters evolving here, because things evolve because there's space for them, because there's room for them to fill out in the ecosystem. You get an evolution because there's a blank spot someplace that you can evolve into that will accept you, so you can be part of the system. Okay, so those are more constrained, less constrained, and the way you get into these various systems is just by switching data streams. There's a data stream that you're in now. It's in this virtual reality game that we're in, okay, in this reality. If you want to end up in a different one, you just switch data streams. How do you do that? You do that with the focus of your mind. It's a matter of consciousness. It's something you learn to do. You switch data streams. Somebody told me, he says, well, that's hacking the system, isn't it? And I said, well, that's a neat term. Yeah, in a sense that is. That's hacking the system. You're in this system, and you can kind of skip and get another system, and you can be in a couple of systems at the same time. There's nothing that requires you to only be in one at a time. It's however many data streams that you can receive data and parallel process what's going on. Okay, so that's basically then what this altered states of consciousness business is about. You go into an altered states of consciousness, what you're doing is that you're letting go of the physical. You're letting go of this data, okay, which means you usually close your eyes, you get in some place you're not disturbed, you get all the thoughts out of your mind, all the operations. Okay, once you do that, your awareness of the physical starts to disappear. And pretty soon you're not really aware of your surroundings anymore. Typically that's the result of a good meditation state, is your surroundings just go away. Well, what are you then? If you're not aware of this, then you're not getting the data here. You're kind of free to attach the data someplace else. And you do that with your intent. So that's basically the origins of paranormal experiences in UBI. It's phenomena that are taking place in this super system, but interacting with the subsystem. Okay. Okay, some logical implications. Reality frames, past and future. Basically, what I want to tell you here is that there are three major databases in this larger reality frame. Okay, one database is called the probable future reality. And what this is, now this is a database I'm talking about, concerned with us, concerned with this particular virtual reality game. Now that database calculates everything that could possibly happen with us, with all the people here in this game. Everything that could possibly happen. It's just a probability set in this database. Now you think that might be hard, right, to determine what possibly could happen among, what, 6 billion people. It's not that hard. You have all the data. You know, from this consciousness spot, you know everything that every individual has thought, done, wished for, wished that nobody else knew, all these things. It's all part of the record because this consciousness is data. So all the data is recorded. So it's not that hard to have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen next. So the next delta t, time increments in the simulation, you say, well, what's likely to happen? What are all the things that could happen? And you put those down, and then you say, well, given that that does happen, what's the thing that could happen next after that, and next after that, and you work your way out. Well, obviously, the further out you get, the rattier your answers are getting, because each one assumes that the last one was correct. And we know that people have free will, and it doesn't have to be correct at all. You can do something that's not expected. So free will now takes place in the present. That's just the moment. It's this present. Okay, we're in this delta t. We exercise our free will. Now, what we've done now is choose one of those states that possibly could happen. That state now is our present state, and the next delta t, that state becomes on our history thread. It becomes history. Okay, now the history database is everything that we did do, all the free will choices that we made. Now there's one more database, and that's all the things we could have done, but didn't. So it's all those other probable states that we said everything that could have happened that didn't get actualized by free will. All those things then become the things we could have done, but didn't do. Okay, so now we have these three databases. Now in the mystical literature, these databases are referred to the Akashic records, okay, and this is where all the information is. Well, they're just databases, and the way that you query these databases is with your intent. And you query them just like any other database. You have to give it some idea of what it is you're looking for. If you just say, oh, get me data, well, you just, get something that doesn't make any sense. You have to use your intent to query the database, and it works. Actually, it's a very nice database. You can even get it to output in the format you want. You want graphical output, you can get graphical output. You want it in visuals, color, you can get it in visuals and color. You want pictures, metaphors, symbols, you can get it pretty much however you want it. It's just a matter of the intent. You as consciousness have access to these databases. You can also get in and experience these databases. If you get into that probable future database, and you do that while you're asleep, you have a precognitive dream. Okay? If you get into that history thread, the things that we did do, then you're kind of in our historical line. If you get into the things that we didn't do that are history, you're in alternate realities. And one of the solutions in quantum mechanics is a many worlds theory. Well, there are many worlds. There's many worlds in this historical database, things that could have happened that didn't. And that's sort of where they're coming from with that many worlds theory, but the thing is they're just probable. It's populated by probability models of all of us. And you can get into those probability models and you can play what-if games. You can say, well, okay, what if I'd done this differently? What would happen? And you can run through the probabilities, because if this was different, then that would be different, and that would be different. And you can follow it just like you're watching a movie. You can go back in a historical record and say, well, what if this didn't happen? What if that did? Let's follow the probabilities forward. Now, it doesn't mean that the probabilities you follow forward is actually what it might have happened, because we're not dealing with free will now. We're only dealing with probabilities in the database. So all the data having to do with this game we're in is in these three databases. They're open to access with your intent. Okay, that was really the point there. One other thing is that the future exists in probability and remains that way, which means unrendered. I'm using render as like the video games. We talk about the rendering of the action, right? You're in World of Warcraft and you got monsters and you got a character that does its thing. And the computer has to render the game. That means draw the pictures that you see on the screen. Well, okay, in this reality game that we're in, It stays in probability, it's unrendered until some player requires the data. Well, makes a measurement. Well, that's the same as in those video games, right? When you pop over a hill in a video game, all of a sudden you see trees sprouting up out of the ground and the buildings appear and things. The game doesn't render it when there's nobody there and there's no players there that need to see it. That's a waste of computer resources. Okay? Any evolving system like this evolves to be parsimonious. It evolves to be efficient. You don't render things you don't need to just because somebody might be there sometime. Now, this principle of things stay unrendered until a player requires a measurement, this idea allows this theory to derive quantum mechanics. Right now, quantum mechanics is a mystery in the sense that physicists know how to apply it. It's a mathematical formalism that if you apply it correctly, do the math right, you get answers that predict what happens in experiments. So it's a really good theory. But if you ask a physicist, well, why is it like that? Why is it that an electron really doesn't exist anywhere? It's some probability distribution. That doesn't make any sense. Particles ought to be someplace. Why is it nowhere? Why is it some probability distribution? And your answer will be, it's just the way it is. They don't know why it should be that way. There's nothing in physics theory that will tell you that reality needs to be probabilistic like that. We just know that if we assume that it's that way, we can calculate answers, and the answers are right. That's all. Well, this theory, now I'm giving you just very top level buzzing across. If you want to know the details and the derivation of all this, you'll have to read the books. But this theory actually derives quantum mechanics, and it derives quantum mechanics not only for the small things, which is where our quantum mechanics is, but it shows that the same principles are in the macro world as well. And we don't notice them. And tomorrow when we do this in a lot more detail, I'll get into that in some detail so you can see how this actually works, how quantum mechanics is derived, and how this makes sense. And no, this is not, does a tree fall in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, does it make a sound? It's not that sort of thing. Okay, results. Just look at a summary. Basically what we've determined is that modeling consciousness as a self-modifying digital information system that evolves toward states of lower entropy. That's how we're modeling consciousness. Remember, the model, is not the reality. It's the model of the reality. Okay. That physical reality is a virtual reality, a subset of the larger consciousness system designed to help budding individual units of consciousness, us, lower our entropy, grow up, evolve through experience and interaction with each other with free will. Okay, now what are the results of this? The results are that physics and metaphysics become parts of one logical theory and are thus unified. Okay, we have a theory that'll predict quantum mechanics, basically derive it. It works in the physical world with our rule set. It also tells you about altered states, about the paranormal. The paranormal, when you look at it from the perspective of the bigger picture, isn't paranormal at all, it's just normal. It only appears to be paranormal when you look at it from the little subset that has only part of the data and is constrained with a rule set. Now it's paranormal. The bigger picture, it's normal. That's the way consciousness is. It's just the nature of consciousness. So we've integrated Eastern Western philosophy, theology, they're all integrated. And the interesting thing here is that when you read, say, Eastern mysticism, when you read about Siddhartha and his life, when you read about the Gnostics, Western mysticism, when you look at most theology, after understanding what's in these books, you can see the threads of truth through all those things. It's like, oh, I see that because that's fundamental. That's the nature of consciousness. And you can see all the threads. And what this theory does, it ties all those threads together. Instead of having 100 separate threads of truth, and everybody knows that there's little threads of truth all over the place, it says how all these threads tied together. What's the TOE, the theory of everything? What's the one overarching understanding that makes all of these threads come together under one description, one understanding? Makes them work, makes them make sense, makes them logical. Okay, what we've also learned here is that love and spirituality are both defined in terms of entropy, a measurable quantity. Okay, that's more suitable for physics. We found out that if you say that, lowering your entropy, or you could say raising the quality of your consciousness, or you could say spiritual growth, all those things, or you could say becoming love. All those things are synonyms. They all mean the same thing. Okay, love is fundamental. Love is another, growing toward love is another way of saying lowering your entropy. You say these are all things. The other thing is that everything is netted. Consciousness, being the digital system that it is, sort of like the internet in a way. Everything's netted. Communication between all the entities is fundamental. It's even netted outside of these reality frames. You can net, all the reality frames are netted. You follow these nets. You can use the URL to bring up these various nets with your intent. Okay? We've derived the fundamental purpose of existence, and in general, our existence in particular, that is to evolve toward lower entropy states. Normal and paranormal are unified as ordinary artifacts of consciousness. Quantum mechanics has been derived. Other results. When you lower your entropy, grow up, become more love-like, remember one of the things about lowering entropy is you can do more. You gain power. The car can do more if all the parts are together. Well, if all your parts are together and you have lowered your entropy, you can do more. Okay? Not only can you move around between these various reality systems, but you can do the things that in this reality system we call as paranormal. Now, you don't have to do these things. They're not required to grow up. It's not like you need to get into paranormal things in order to lower your entropy. Not true. But you can. It's accessible to you. So a higher quality consciousness has more ability to affect things, to do things. I think I've said this, lower entropy, spiritual growth, increasing the quality of your consciousness, it's all the same thing. It's growing up. Love is the fundamental expression of low entropy consciousness. Consciousness is an aware, evolving system. It's real and finite. We're individuated units of that consciousness. We're netted. We're a chip off the old block. That means we're consciousness in a system of consciousness. We have the same attributes. All reality frames are basically equivalent. It's just a matter of the perspective of the observer. They're all connected. They're all netted. Next. Okay, let's talk about what's happening in the Austin workshop. I'm going to tell you a few things here. I'd like to give you just a little. I came up here with this watch so I could keep track of my time, and it still says 0.000. I didn't push it, so I really don't know where we are. But assuming that we are all right for another few minutes, then I would like to give you just a little idea of some of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow. I'd like to run a bulldozer over some of your favorite beliefs and see what you think about that. Because of the nature of consciousness, that's units of bounded organized data, sharing bits, everything is subjective. Okay? Only consistent, well-planned probing and statistical analysis of the results of that probing are carefully, that is, carefully considered experience can give you a sense of what the objective reality behind the data is like. In other words, you're getting data. There is something objective behind that data. It's only your interpretation of it that's subjective, but you'll never know what's behind that data or the consistency. You'll never be able to model it and understand its causality if you don't do science there, if you don't experiment, if you don't do it methodically. If all you do is go up and fly around and experience it, it's fun, and you may learn a little, but you're never really going to get very far with it. You're not going to understand the larger system unless it's a scientific journey, unless you make that kind of commitment to do research there. to make rational sense out of, that is to be able to communicate your personal, non-physical experience, you turn that experience into metaphors and symbols that have specific meaning to you, relate to your experience database. Thus, much of what you see and hear and smell and feel on the non-physical is created by yourself as the closest pattern match that you can make to bridge between what you experience and what is in your personal database. In other words, you can only interpret it based on what's in your own database, what you understand, what's in your brain. You're kind of stuck with that for your interpretation. So when you have that experience and you get that data, you get a subjective experience, and it's in terms of metaphors, it's in terms of symbols, and it's restricted by what you got to work with, which is your own experience database. Okay, so a lot of what you get is you, right? A lot of what you find out there is you. Okay, the more you probe, explore, make connections, gain understanding, the greater and more capable that personal experiential database becomes. So you refine that database in an iterative way, so that it eventually will be able to interpret these non-physical experiences with a minimum of distortion. It takes a long time. I'd say to get good at that, you probably at least a decade of researching, probably twice that. It takes a long time. Okay. It should be clear then to you why skepticism is so critical. Why you must learn to live with uncertainty. This is a very important thing. You have to be able to live with uncertainty. People who can't live with uncertainty tend to believe things. They get an uncertain place and they don't know, well, that's uncomfortable. So they believe something and fill up that comfort with a belief. You have to learn to live with uncertainty. You have to be skeptical. Know a lot of times you don't have the answer. It may take you years to find the answer, but you got to live with that rather than jump to some convenient belief that fills that gap in and makes you feel better. Okay, so just zipping around in the non-physical really isn't very productive compared to a systematic probing and collecting of data to assess what is fundamental outside of you and what comes from inside of you. Can be done, but it takes time. You have to collect statistics. Now, for these reasons, the Hindus, see 7 very specific chakras, right? Well, the Zen Buddhists don't see those 7 chakras. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the Zen Buddhists aren't as enlightened as the Hindus, or that the Hindus somehow have misunderstood and there really are no chakras? What does that mean? And the shaman, the people in the native kind of consciousness arts, do they all have chakras? No. Well, what's the point here? Is that the Hindus are wrong? No. Chakras are not fundamental. They are a metaphor. Okay? Just a metaphor. It's a way of interpreting the data that makes sense. It's a system of interpreting the data. And a lot of other people can learn your system. And then, pretty soon it becomes a movement, and then it's a religion, and, then it's dogma. But it's just a metaphor. Okay, now, the beams of white light, healers, right, use white light beams, light workers. We've all heard that. That white light is just a metaphor. Light is just a metaphor. We see energy bodies. I'm clairvoyant. I can see energy bodies, but they're just metaphors. There is no energy. We send energy to somebody, make them feel better. Does it work? Sure. Well, what are you doing? You're just focusing your intent. What actually is the active ingredient is your consciousness, not the light. It's the consciousness. You focus your consciousness with tools that help you focus. More people can succeed at focusing their consciousness if they use tools. And they use metaphors, things like chakras or, light beams and things, in order to focus their intent on something, because we have a hard time just focusing our intent if we don't use tools that connect to our physical reality. Well, light beams are like physical. We can think of that as a light beam, right? Lasers, zap. So we can imagine that, and that then focuses our intent on doing something, on having something. So there is really no light, that's a metaphor. There really is no energy, that's a metaphor. These are all tools that we use. Have I stepped on anybody's beliefs yet? Okay. So the energy bodies around people are metaphors for the data that you receive about those people out of these databases. And you're getting that data out of the database with your intent. Okay. People travel through tunnels, go through doors, fly in the non-physical because they believe that in order to get someplace, you have to move. That's why you have to go through a tunnel, because you can't get from A to B without moving. Well, it's consciousness. You don't move. Consciousness doesn't have space. You don't have to go through a tunnel. It's just data. But you interpret that, I was here, now I'm there. Your belief system said, I had to move to go from here to there. Therefore, you create the tunnel to move through. You create the flying so you can have the sense of moving, because otherwise your belief system says you can't move. You haven't gone anywhere because you haven't moved. So these are cultural beliefs we have, and they limit what we can do when we get into these reality frames. We're full of these cultural beliefs. We have all kinds of beliefs that we don't even know we have. Early astral travelers, if you read some of the Carrington and Muldoon, you go back years to the early astral travelers, they all had silver cords. Remember that? They all had silver cords attached. Why did they have silver cords? Nobody has silver cords today. We just, we grow out of silver cords. They had silver cords because they believed the physical was fundamental. And if the physical is fundamental, then it's sort of like the diver has to have the cord, right? Because the physical is fundamental. They need to be attached to it. It also is the security so they can find their way home like breadcrumbs. So if you have these fears and beliefs, then you create these interpretations. So see, being skeptical is very important. You can't do research here if you're not skeptical. People trying to get out of body feel like they've got to sit up, roll out. They get that from Bob Monroe, right? That was his thing. I roll out. And you see people lying there in bed and they're going like this. They're trying to roll out. Well, that's silly, you see. It's consciousness. Going out of body has nothing to do with your body. It's unfortunate they call it going out of body because you think of that as leaving the body, like the body is somehow central to that and then you leave it. It has nothing to do with the body. It's your mind. It has to do with consciousness. You're not leaving a body. It would be much better to call it going out of mind, but that's got other connotations, doesn't it? So we can't call it that, but that's really a better description. So you don't have to roll out, and that actually inhibits people experiencing these things because there they are trying to roll out, trying to sit up, and it doesn't work, they get frustrated. Well, that's because they're trying to do something physical, roll, sit, in order to actually do something with their consciousness. You see what I mean? It doesn't work. They're not connected. So these are just metaphors. Rolling out a body was the way Bob interpreted what he was doing. And he didn't have to try hard. He just popped out because he did. This was natural to him. Well, he just saw that in terms of, I roll out a body. Well, he didn't roll out a body. When he did that, he focused his mind on going out of body, and he went out of body. And he just associated with the rolling. The rolling became a tool, just like the light beam becomes a tool in healing. It's a focusing tool. There's nothing fundamental about anything. So did I step on anybody else's beliefs yet? Let's see. People interact with dead relatives and other entities, and they're always wearing clothes, aren't they? And they're always wearing clothes just like the clothes we wear, or clothes of the period. If it's your great-grandfather, then he's wearing clothes out of the 1920s, that sort of thing. Isn't that amazing how they get those clothes like that? And did you ever notice that the ones that you don't know, entities that you don't know, most of those are wearing robes, right? Because you don't know them, what kind of clothes are you going to dress them in, so you give them a robe. Because it's indecent not to have a robe, right? That's another one of your beliefs. So you go out there and, I saw this guy and he was in a robe, and well, this is you. This is you. Okay? All right, another thing, when we meet these entities, we notice that almost all of them are humanoid in form. They look sort of like us, don't they? You know, the head, arms, and head. At least the ones that are good guys. The good guys all look like us. The bad guys all look like something else. You know, they kind of creatures and monsters and all kinds of other shapes. It's nothing but data moving back and forth between consciousness. That's all it is, and interpretations. And once you understand the larger reality system is digital consciousness system, then all the rest of these things make sense. You can understand why the Zen Buddhists don't see chakras. You know, you can understand why, you know, quantum mechanics can be derived, why things have to be, you know, like they are in physics. You can understand basically everything. That's what a theory of everything does. It lets you understand everything in one context. Explorers report what they see with their own eyes, right? They go out in the non-physical and they come back and say, this is what I saw. However, when you're in the non-physical, you don't have eyes. Okay? Now we interpret what we experience in terms of our physical sense data because that's our habit. So we go out and say what we see and what we felt and what we heard. That's our interpretation of that data in terms of our physical senses because we can't interpret it any other way. If we don't interpret it in terms of our physical senses, we can't make any sense out of it in our own mind. That's the only way we can make sense out of it. The only way we can tell somebody else about it is to put it in terms of our own reference frame, which is this physical reality reference frame, where we put it in terms of sense data. Okay, so that's just habit. That's why we do that. The only way we know how to express and communicate is in terms of sense data, because that's what's in our database. Being skeptical, having no expectations, and not having any biases or beliefs is critical to getting that good pattern match, that accurate metaphor that captures the essence of your non-physical experience. And the only way to do that is to go there and learn and experiment. Now it'll help you to read these books because it'll give you the context. It'll give you a leg up on it because you can understand how it all fits together. But that's just intellectual understanding, and that's not going to help you grow at all. It can get you focused, it can point the direction, it can tell you how, it can explain what it's like, but it won't make you grow at all. You got to go do it. So that's why I say it doesn't really matter whether you believe me or not believe me. That isn't going to change your life one bit. What matters to you is what you do with it. You know, where you take it, where your experiences are. If it's just, well, that's kind of interesting, but, I don't know how to do this, or I don't want to, or it frightens me, then you're not going to get there. You're not ready yet. All right, so that's one of the things we're going to talk about. The other things we're going to talk about are things like what's holding you back, the out of body, out of mind, making contact, dealing with fear. Fear is the great inhibitor. Fear is belief. Belief is the great inhibitor. And you have beliefs you don't even know you have. You have lots of beliefs that you don't even know you have. Healing, that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about some of that. And now I get to the last slide, the one I always have to end up with, is you have to be asking the same question that I had about Bob Monroe. You have no other choice. You have to be asking that question. Does this guy know what he's talking about? Is this guy nuts or what? Right? You have to do that. And the only way for you to do that is to have experience. Now, those of you who already have some extensive experience in the larger consciousness system, much of what I say will start to ring a bell. And as you read the books, you'll say, oh yeah, I see that. Yeah, that's the way it was. And it'll start to make sense to you. Because there is only one truth. It's not like we all have a separate truth. We all have a separate interpretation of the truth. But there's only one truth. So that's why 2,600 years ago, Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching, started Taoism, right? Well, if you read that book Lao Tzu wrote, you'll see he was there, he understood it, and what you read in that book and what you read in my books mash right together, except Lao Tzu wrote in poetry. You have to interpret it. You can't interpret it if you don't understand it and you haven't been there. So people read his work and they go, what does this mean? You know, this is strange. But once you go there, you read it and you go, yeah, I know exactly what he means. So there is only one truth, and many people have been there and seen that truth. You know, the difference that I bring to it isn't that I've seen a truth that nobody else has seen. Many people for thousands of years have seen these truths. What I've done to it is I've described it in terms of modern science and technology. I've made a model that is current, that is logical, and that is scientific, and that not only describes the worlds of metaphysics and paranormal, but does things like derives the fundamental basis of quantum mechanics. So it's a big toe. All right, so the key thing here is you got to be skeptical. You got to do the research, and you got to do your work yourself. So let my big toe be the catalyst for your big toe. You got to create your own. In the end, that's a whole lot more important than just listening to me tell you what reality is about. That's all I have. Thank you. Questions? Yes, sir.
There's only one truth, and we have our experiences and we interpret them.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be skeptical about those experiences,
right.
The interpretation of them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk a minute about how we know, how we can be certain when we have seen that truth and understood it correctly, how do we use that skepticism to make sure that we're interpreting things correctly?
It's an iterative process. It's not something that you just go and you see it, aha, that's it, you know. Let's see, so, yeah, that's it. You know, it's not like a matching to something that somebody's told you. It is a long, iterative process. And the way to start that process is by being able to collect evidence from this reality frame. So you do things like, you know, say somebody that has a relative that's ill and knows what that illness is, you know, write their name on a piece of paper and hand it to me, and then you go get into your altered state and you see what's wrong with this person. See if you can diagnose it, and then you ask them and they'll tell you whether you're right or not. That's evidential. You know, you either get it right or you don't. Sometimes it's not clear maybe, but you do it enough. So you do those kinds of things, you do evidential things until you really are good at your altered states. So you really have your mind under control. So you know what's you and what's not you. You've gotten your ego and your operational mind, you know, out of the equation. And once you get that, that's like step one. Okay, then as you explore and come up with your concepts of the truth, you always have to apply and see, does it make sense? You know, does this, it's the same four things I said makes a theory good. You got to look at it and you say, does this make sense? And what you'll find is that, yes, we all come at it from our own individual viewpoint, but it all converges. Eventually, as we learn and we iterate, we all end up with basically the same thing. So you can read, you know, about Siddhartha's view of reality, and you can see that it's the same as Lao Tzu's. And you can see it's the same that's in My Big T.O.E. And you can see it's the same as, you know, any number of other people have seen it. And once you start seeing that, and it's the same as what you discover, then you start to have confidence that what you're seeing is real. And if what you're seeing makes sense to you, it has to make, you have to apply it. In other words, this is not just theoretical. You have to apply it to your life. If what you understand as truth works when you use it, when you do it, then it rings true to you. And then you can look around and see, you know, did anybody else figure this out? You know, and you'll probably find that it did. And people end up converging to the same idea from different directions. So that's how you do it. It's not an easy, quick thing. Yes?
Hold up a moment, please. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay, we have another question. Back there on the left.
I'm sorry. Now you're in charge. Ask the next person.
Okay. My name is Melissa, and I hope I can frame this question. It's about the nature of intent. I'm a very good companion of intent, but I don't understand what it is. Is it a force of consciousness? Is it consciousness, a method of communication within consciousness? What is its nature?
It's the focus. Your intent.
I understand to work with it. I just don't
Yeah.
know what its essence is.
It is the active principle of consciousness. Intent is the thing that focuses consciousness.
Understood.
It's the thing that it's the expression of what do you say? You might say expression of the desire. It's the expression of what it is that you want, you need. It's a will. You can call it will. That may be a thing for it. It's the will.
I think I didn't ask my question well, and I was afraid of that. What I'm trying to get at is it a force, as in the force of gravity? When you're talking about the realm of consciousness, how would you qualify or classify where intent fits? How do you...
Intent is the thing that you call it a force, but force isn't quite right. And no, it's not like gravity. That's not quite right.
Yeah.
It's like you have an intent to get certain information out of these databases.
Right.
If you have that intent, you get the information. If you don't have that intent, you don't get the information.
But what is that intent? What is it?
Will.
Is it a function of
Focus.
free will? In other words, does that come with inhabiting a reality that has free will? Or does it live in the world of consciousness, and is it just as applicable when free will isn't in the equation?
Free will's always in the equation in
For
consciousness.
For us.
Yeah, free will's always in the equation, and free will expresses the intent of your consciousness. So we can put that, maybe that will help. What you do, the actions, what you do with that free will is an expression of the intent of your consciousness. It's kind of the active principle of consciousness.
I understand, and I still don't think I'm asking the right...
Yeah, I understand. It's a hard thing. I think I know what you're asking, and I don't know how to put it in words to
So it's not something you've looked at, and if I read your book, I wouldn't find a discussion.
No, I don't think
of
you'll
that.
find a definition. We are stuck here with the vocabulary that was designed for some other discussion.
Yeah.
We're stuck with the vocabulary that was designed to talk about physical things. That's what our language works. That's how our words work. It's how our concepts work. And now we're trying to describe things that are outside of that reality, and language gets very difficult sometimes when we do that. And this is one of those things. I don't know. I haven't really thought to define it in the way that you're looking for. It's like intuitively clear to me.
Of course.
What intent is.
Yes.
Trying to put it into English that would make a good answer to your question. I don't have one.
Darn it.
Okay, somebody can move the mic.
Tom, what's going to happen is Pamela is going to cover this side of the room, and I'm going to cover this side of the room. And I think your hand went up first. It's not prejudice, everyone, even though it's not.
One of the foremost authorities on intent and intention and how it works would be William Tiller. And he's written some books in the area. He's been studying it intently for some years now. And that would be the main source of the nature of intention. But again, we're talking about something that's kind of ephemeral here. I think of visualization as maybe part of the process too. And getting ego out of this. And also, a strong intention, in my way of looking at things, is you have it and then you put it aside, you forget about it. And then somehow things happen down the road. That's one way of looking at it too. You don't want to let ego get too tied into this kind of phenomenon, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you so much for such an interesting evening, and we're looking forward to more of this tomorrow. My question I'm going to ask, and I'm asking myself the same question, it has somewhat of a rhetorical character to it. It's a teleological question, and a very fundamental one, as I would say it. Would the motivation, one's motivation, desire, interest in, pursuit of going there, if you will, if you know what I mean by that, could we explain it in terms of maybe the reason why to pursue this, have an interest in it in the first place, would be that there is some virtue, or that it would be hedonistic, personal enrichment, or some kind of mental masturbation, something. You get the general idea. It's a very fundamental question that I'm even asking myself. Would be a drive to go there.
To go into the non-physical?
Wherever.
Now you can grow, you can become more spiritual, you can raise the quality of consciousness, decrease your entropy, all those things, without ever doing anything paranormal, without ever traveling outside of this reality frame. We're here in a learning lab, and we have all the tools we need right here. So why do that? It's because you can, and it's because it's your you might say birthright is consciousness. It's part of what you are. So it's fundamental to you and your being to express yourself in that way. It's not a requirement. It's not like if you don't do these things, if you don't get into paranormal, if you don't travel in other reality frames, you're kind of stuck and you can't grow up and you won't, become spiritual. That's not true. It's not true at all. It's not a necessary step that you have to take. There are those people that never go there and become very spiritual. They don't need it. Now they could go there if they wanted to. Just a little bit of training, a little bit of effort, they could, and they see no point in it. I'm a scientist. I go everywhere. I push the boundaries. If I can go there, I will go there. That's just my nature, and it's probably your nature as well, that you go wherever you can because you can. Sort of like, why do people climb mountains? It's just because they have tops. Curiosity, and because being a physicist, I want to understand it. I want to be able to understand the causality in that large. I don't know how it works. I want to put it all together. I want to know why the Zen Buddhists don't see chakras. That's an anomaly to me. It's a thing that doesn't fit. I want to understand it all. So that's why I go there, because that's how I learn these things. And besides that, it's interesting. It's fun. You do learn a lot. It's another whole set of experiences. You see, you learn from experience. So we have these experiences within this framework that's physical, but that's limited to our physics, right? Now, we also have experiences in a dream world. That's another set of experiences when we dream. So that's another reality we can interact in. And then there's all the rest of this reality that we can go have experiences in and interact in. And it's all just another opportunity to learn through different sets of experiences. You can learn through the limited experiences you have, but it's so much more fun from my viewpoint and so much more interesting, and enables me to see bigger pictures if I can also learn through other reality systems. So that would be the answer.
Can we now say that God, universal intelligence, and consciousness are kind of the same thing?
Yeah, when you say the word God, everybody in here has their own viewpoint on what that means. So it's not a very well, it's not a very well defined word. But yes, I get the kind of the intent of what you say. Yes, if you're looking for the embodiment of all that is, if you say it that way, it's consciousness. It's the larger consciousness system. But the larger consciousness system is an evolving system. It's not a little old guy in a white beard playing with his pet people. That's not the vision. It's a big system, and the system does things like break up into pieces because that's more efficient. It evolves better that way. So it's yes. You can say that. You can also say that these ideas support intelligent design, right? You can go there and say that too. But it's a little different sense of that than what's normally meant when those words are used. But you see it as a bigger picture. You know, this not only answers, you know, things like Eastern philosophy, but you can look at theology, and you can see the threads of truth in theology. And you can also see where they turn into dogma and where it doesn't ring true with the larger perspective and understanding, and that you can see where it does as well. All these traditions do have threads of truth in them, but they also have a lot of other junk. And this allows you to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff there. Yeah.
In the course of your exploring and probing over the years, have you found yourself heading towards specific realities or certain these places or realities in that time? And along with that, in your workshop, are you going to talk about specific methods or applications for accessing these places? I noticed you, in your notes, you had written, you made references to psychotropic drugs and...
Yeah, we're going to discuss those. We're going to discuss them generally. It's not going to be a workshop that's going to teach particular methods. I can talk about a few methods just generally. Oh, here's what they do, and here's how they work, and here's the... But it's not going to be, you know, let's all lie down and, you know, breathe deeply and, you know, do that kind of thing. It's not that sort of a thing. But we will discuss those things. Yes, but it'll be more in a general way, and a way to understand them and how they work and how that enables you to, you know, to get out of body and do that that sort of thing. So in a general way, the answer is yes. In a very particular and specific way, no.
Question in the back.
Tom, I'm trying to put my mind around all this stuff, and it seems to me that there's quite a bit of commonality when you're talking about these various states of consciousness and the various kinds of scenarios that you create when you're dreaming. And one of the things that occurs to me is that in a lucid dream, we can sort of guide our experience consciously. I'm wondering if we use some of these other techniques like the hemisync or something like that to go into a different state or a different part of our reality, so that, for instance, let's say someone who's had very bad luck most of their life and they want to explore having good luck for a change, and they find a reality in which they're experiencing very good luck, which is probably something that's many of us would like to find. I wonder if one could become so enamored of that state that they could become stuck and not be able to return to our mundane, everyday reality. And I'm not sure whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm wondering if one was to become stuck in this other reality, if that would constitute for those around us a state of insanity.
Well, yeah, I understand your question. It is a good question. In general, now, you know, there's always, when we talk about real things, we tend to talk in generalities, and there's always exceptions, you know, to every generality. There's an exception that's the other way. But in general, it's not going to be a problem of getting stuck. That's not likely to happen. There's several reasons for that. One, your body's probably going to pull you back in a sense that eventually you're going to get a pain in your belly, you know, you're going to get an itch, you know, on your forehead, you're going to have to get up and go to the bathroom, you know, something's going to happen and your body is going to call you home. So that's not likely to happen. It's that, you know, I won't say that that's an impossibility. Yes, it could be that some people could wander off and basically, what would you say? They'd be kind of a vegetable here, right? They'd be off someplace else in some other space. That could happen, but it would be a very rare event for that to happen. Another reason that doesn't happen is that you gain access to these realities. You gain the ability to do this by growing up, by reducing your entropy, by getting rid of ego. When you get rid of ego, going to a place where you have good luck doesn't make any, you know, it isn't attractive. if you have ego to where you go to a place where all the girls are pretty and all the luck is good, right? And you want to stay there, well, that's, if you had ego that made you feel that way, you're probably not going to get there in the first place. You're going to be tied a little closer to home. So the system kind of works in a way to make that extremely unlikely. But almost nothing is impossible. Another...
Thank you, Tom. You had mentioned that your big aha experience when you and Dennis were in your deprivation tanks and Bob then recorded, and this recording was you and Dennis talking back and forth. Mm-hmm. Would you describe that experience as both you and Dennis leaving and going to a separate place, a separate reality together, or were you individually in your own realities and you just happened to tap into it? And the sub-question in that is that there's theories out there that there is a fabric or an interwoven, almost like a spider web, woven reality that sits out there, that when people have these types of experiences, that they get up and onto that network or that fabric or that reality, and they can travel around on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's just another metaphor. That's a way to say it, that you get up into the network and travel around. It's just a metaphor. Mm-hmm. It's not fundamental. But what Dennis and I did is that we met in the out-of-body state. We both went right up above the laboratory, and we hovered probably about 20 feet above the roof. And I don't remember now which one of us got there first, but they waited for the other. And yes, you can describe it that way. You could say that basically our minds were taking a trip together. That's a valid way to put it. That's a little different metaphor than talking about the out-of-body experience. But these are all metaphors. You kind of have to stop making the non-physical realities just kind of different versions of this reality. And we do that when we talk about out-of-body. Out-of-body is a place, and you go certain places, and there's distance and time, and you'll have all these things. Well, that's us making this data that we're sharing. That's us turning that into something that we can understand. So yes, if you want to describe it in the way that you described it, different metaphor accomplishes basically the same thing.
And so did you two then, if I may follow up, go and have remote viewing together?
No, we actually, first we met up, and then we were communicating just like we were talking to each other. We were having conversations, and we just kind of headed off to have an adventure, kind of going out there. So the intent was to go out and experience, because we wanted to have a very rich experience that wouldn't be hard to tell whether or not we were having it together. So it had to be something very, unique and different. So we had those intents, and we kept each other in mind. So our minds were connected in that sense, in your concept of netted minds, and we did have those experiences. We did see other non-physical entities. We interacted with them. We saw different things. So we were getting data. We were both getting the same data stream, basically. We were attached to the same data stream, having the same experiences. Now, we interpreted them slightly differently because we were two different people, but they were close enough that you could tell it was two different people viewing the same data.
My memory is from having been at the Monroe Institute with Jim, is that Robert Monroe he created a tape, and he and friends met in a place he called the park, as if they were talking on the telephone. So he actually has a tape about what you apparently pioneered with Dennis. He later created that.
Yes.
Another question.
Yeah, and see, that's the park now is another metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
I have another question here.
Well, as a individuated unit of consciousness, I'm wondering, is there an endpoint to all this? We're evolving somewhere, we're changing. Is there an endpoint? Is there a state change that occurs, or do we just kind of keep doing this forever?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at it, and in my books I discuss kind of this endpoint thing, and part of this falls into that area of things that you don't know, beyond your knowing. You're back in that being that bacterium again, and you just can't know things. But there's several possibilities. I do a little speculation in the books there, but it is clearly labeled speculation. This is a digital system. So the consciousness system is a digital system. Now it can, at any time, it's resource limited. It's only got so much memory, so much ability to process. It's a finite system, right? It's a real system. So if it gets to a point where it needs more memory, well, what can it do? It can just purge its least productive bits, right? And reallocate. It can upload to some maybe larger system that it's a part of. It can hit the reset button, start over. It can do reset. It can back up. It can do all the same digital tricks that you can do with your remote, on your digital TV. It can say, well, let's go back to this point because that was a real interesting bridge point right there. Let's start over from that one. It can do any of those things. It can end the simulation for us, start a new one, or it can repopulate this one. It can do whatever it wants because it's digital simulation. In other words, if you're the programmer, you can write the program the way you want. You can do the rule set, the way you want. So there's a lot of choices in a digital system. Now, does anything get lost? Well, maybe. Probably not. You might think of it being, that there's a larger system. In my books, I kind of get a little silly with it. I go into humor a little bit, and I say, well, think of, okay, I call this one cell, this big consciousness system. I give it an acronym. And, it was a cute acronym. I gave it AOM because, people sit around with their legs crossed going, AOM. And I called it AOM, but it's an acronym, and it stands for something. And anyway, so then I say, well, maybe this AOM is just a cell, a larger consciousness cell. And what if it splits? You get two cells, and maybe, there's all kinds of cells, and maybe these cells go together and make some other kind of bigger thing. And then I imagine an Aomosaurus, trudging through the mental landscape. But of course, that's just being silly, and it's using a little humor to point out that you can't really know the answers to those kind of questions directly. But a digital system has lots of opportunity. It's not limited into what it can do. So whether it uploads, purges the least useful bits, maybe it can manufacture more ones and zeros, more reality cells. It can just duplicate those. Perhaps, it can only maybe duplicate so many because that's all its mind can hold. It can't track any more than that. Maybe then it just expands its own memory and what it allocates to various functions. So I don't know, and it's all speculation when you get to that level. It's not science anymore. It's speculation. Another question?
I have found this a very interesting conversation.
Well, good.
I'm here because of a dream.
Ah.
In the dream, a man with white hair and a white beard was speaking to a child, conveying information that connected two different ideas, trying to connect this child to these different ideas. And the child was, in a sense, connected with all people, and this man was connecting these disparate ideas to the child and to the ideas. I interpreted that dream when I woke up as Santa Claus talking to a child. And the voiceover as I woke up said, in time, a man will realize his true lifelong vocation is building bridges. The next day, I received an email from the Young Society, which announced that Christopher Anderson, who often plays Santa Claus, was going to do a presentation on this day at this time talking about the mythology of Santa Claus and the sort of larger picture of that image. So I showed up at this day and this time. And here you are, connecting two very disparate systems of thought among a large group of people, and right behind me is a young child. It's very interesting, mostly because you actually haven't stepped on any of the things I know to be true from my own experiences. So I think it's very cool that you are bringing to a world that relies on measurable physical data effectively proof that measurable physical data isn't all there is. I think that's really cool.
Well, all I have to say about that is, ho, ho, ho. Ho, 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 ho.
The one thing I did notice that you didn't say much about was the idea of consciousness reducing entropy by creating subsets of itself, which seems to imply to me that we are in fact all connected and all part of the same consciousness.
That is correct.
And I think the next step might perhaps be, as this sphere is descending through flatland, trying to explain itself, the next step is to try to answer the question not from the level at which it was asked, but at the next higher level,
right,
where you can see more. And the metaphor of a digital world is useful. And what happens when we drop that metaphor too?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That was a nice comment.
Moving beyond the metaphor of the digital reality, we have two more questions. Jan is first.
I've had a few minor mini aha moments of my own in the course of the last couple of weeks doing research on this very interesting person called Tom Campbell I had never previously heard of. And I've had a few more mini aha moments of my own tonight. The challenge, I think, for me is partially that I'm going to have a lot of trouble putting these into words. And I'm going to have a lot of trouble putting this question into words. I've made about 4 pages of notes trying to get it down to a manageable level where it's not going to take me 20 minutes just to ask the question. And so I think what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to try and pick my way through it and hope that I don't sound too incoherent. I wrote down earlier something that's more or less, I mean, I won't swear it's verbatim, what you said, that consciousness, well, consciousness, we've talked a lot about it. There's been a definite itness about consciousness, the larger consciousness, the larger reality, in the course of this evening. And at one point you said that consciousness facilitates its own evolution by budding off, I believe was the term, the metaphor used, many smaller units of consciousness, us, and setting them loose to evolve towards lower entropy. You know, more or less, I won't swear to the exact formulation, but that's more or less how I wrote it down. Now, of course, the interesting thing for me, and I'm trying to, as it were, distill my question out of that, is that there seems to be a hidden assumption there, and I'm not sure if the hidden assumption is just a consequence, a side effect of the metaphor chosen, as it were, but it seems to me to affect the way that we think of the larger consequence in all its itness, in the sense that there's another potential way to look at this. You can look at it in terms of, okay, there's this larger it consciousness out there budding off smaller consciousnesses such as we are, trying to understand itself better. My thought or my gut feeling, if you like, with that is that, I have this intuitive response of, to what extent do we need the itness of that large consciousness? I mean, it sounds very sophomoric and very much like, the Bishop Young's old joke about the tree falling in the forest. If I say that, as I could very easily say and have everybody here in the room laugh, am I a figment of your imagination or are you one of mine? And the interesting thing is that to me that there's sort of that same slightly dubious tinge attaches to what seems to be the hidden assumption of, are you and I a figment of its imagination, that is the larger consciousness, and would it not be just as easy to say in the metaphorical sense, and possibly more parsimoniously, that, there's us, and that we are all these little bits of consciousness making up this it, but that the it actually gets its itness from us.
The problem that they're having there is a problem created by language. Language is we use it imprecisely often, particularly in cases like this where it's a very high-level discussion, and to call the larger consciousness in it that itness is really inaccurate. It's when you use that word in you get more precise as you're doing exactly what that word means. That sets up a boundary between us and it, right? That's it, and we're here, and now there's separation. It's not like that. It is us. We are it. It's not that we're here and it's there, and there's a separate thing, and we're the little people doing together, and it's watching. It's a big system. It's a big natural system that is evolving to lower energy states, and we're a piece of it. And it's not really an itness as different from us. It's not a like an us and them sort of thing. That's sure, you use that terminology because that's the way you tend to communicate at a higher level. But you're right, it's not. We are it. It is us. We are one. It is all that is, and we are part of that. So it's an integrated thing. It's not that it's there, we're here. We're it. We are it. It are us,
That, go ahead. Before we take the last question, this very patient gentleman sitting right here, I just want to compliment the people who've asked questions, because this has really, in a way, brought some of what you said really alive. Several people have said they really were enjoying the questions. So you have the honor of the last question.
It's a two-part. One's a question, one's a statement. The statement is it's called unbounded, absolute unbounded manifold. That was your from the book, right?
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Absolute unbounded manifold.
Right, yeah. So, and the last question is, when you go into this state when you're going out of body, Gerald Donald, I did a little research into that with Probable Future as his own thing. But is it delta, the delta level that your brain's going into when you get out of body? I know it's supposed to go beta, alpha, theta, then delta.
Yeah, no, it's...
Is it deeper than delta?
Well, it's kind of an odd question in the sense it's none of those things. It's not that the physical system creates the out of body. So it's not like, well, the physical system gets into delta and bang, that means you're out of body. It's not like that. It's the mind attaching to another data stream. It's the mind, not the body, that's the issue. Now, when the mind attaches to the data stream, it can do that in several EEG wavelengths. We talk about delta, that's the lower EEG, 1-2 hertz down in that region. Well, you can daydream while you are walking down the street, right? And here you're a physical body walking down the street. You're still in this physical reality. You can even drive your car that way. Probably isn't safe, but you can do things. You can be in this reality and do that stuff. Well, you're not in a delta state then, but you are parallel processing, and you're in two realities at once. Part of you's in this reality, part of you's in another reality. Your night dreams, your REM sleep, when you have those dreams, I think a lot of that's in the theta state. Delta state tends to be, without the REM, it's the just, dead asleep sort of thing. That doesn't mean that you're not also experiencing then too. So you can experience in other reality systems in various altered states. It's not just one altered state that does that. And basically these reality systems that you get into in these various states are just a little different. But it's all part of that consciousness thing. They're all very similar. The night dreams that you have are very similar to your lucid dreams, are very similar to out-of-body experiences. It's you're attaching to these other data streams. And it's just that when you do it purposefully and consciously, you're in control of it. When you have a night dream, you're not in control of it. You just, you're having another experience in another reality frame. So it's not like that the delta means this and that the theta means that. You can do various things in all of those. Matter of fact, with a little practice, you can learn to be, I guess in theta states and beta states at the same time. You can have your EEG producing two large peaks in that area. So you can be aware in a alternate reality while carrying on a conversation in this reality. So it's not really isolated to one thing, one state. So it's not as body-centered. We tend to make everything kind of body-centered because the body is the center of our reality here. But it's really mind. It's really the consciousness that's the key here.